Hello there, Flip here, and today we're going to be taking an in-depth look into Mualani, one of the leading characters in Natlan, covering her best artifacts, weapons, teams, as well as giving a small meta evaluation to how good I think she'll be. But before we do that, as always, if at any point during the video you're entertained or informed, make sure to drop a like and even consider subscribing, as Natlan is around the corner and I'll try to keep you updated with all the info. And with that, let's begin. Mualani is a 5-star Hydra character that, guess what, uses a catalyst. She's a DPS unit that focuses on dealing big hits over her rotation, so let's explain how she works. Her normal attacks don't really do anything special, so there's no need to dote on that. The main meat of her kit is in her skill. When she activates it, she enters her special Night Soul Blessing state, which is just a fancy stance change unique to Natlan characters. In her Night Soul Blessing state, she will hop on her shark friend and her normal attacks are now converted into shark bites. Mualani has 4 stages to her bites depending on how many wave momentum stacks you have, with each stage being stronger than the last. The way you get these stacks is by making contact with an enemy, so to get the maximum amount of these stacks, you're going to need to hug an enemy until it builds up, and then unleash a bite. Don't ask. Mualani's skill state lasts for 6 seconds at a base, but through things like her Ascension 1, she'll be able to stay in this state for up to 10 seconds. And her duration is very important, as since she builds up stacks, she ends up doing very little hits in her rotation. At Constellations 0, she should be able to perform 3 fully stacked shark bites and an additional lower stage bite, which should be the combo you aim for each time. If you want a more in-depth look into her combo, since I don't want this video to be bloated, you can take a look at the previous one I made, which covers that in more depth. Also, adding on to all of this, when you make contact with an enemy, they'll be marked by her shark for up to 5 enemies. And when Mualani hits an enemy with her shark bite, if there are other enemies marked, they will all take the same damage as the primary target. So this is a way for her to deal consistent damage in AoE. The only caveat to this is that when there are multiple enemies marked, her damage will be reduced by 28%, but this isn't a massive deal because in multi-target scenarios, assuming the enemies are relatively close, instead of 3, you should be able to get 4 fully enhanced shark bites. And you also get to hit with her burst, which is also a massive nuke, and it isn't affected by the damage reduction either. Overall, not as big of a loss as it may seem. The only thing I haven't touched on in her kit is her A4, and that is because as it stands now it's not that important. In Night Soul Burst, pretty edgy fucking name by the way, is a mechanic that only Natlan characters can activate, and out of the 2 characters she's releasing with, one of them is a DPS. And the other is actually a pretty good support, but not worth bringing on just for this interaction of increasing her burst damage. To close this section out, for talent priorities, you want to level up her skill first, then her burst, and then there is 0 reason for you to touch her normal attacks, unless you're one of those filthy triple cunning simps. Let's talk about her artifacts next. The trend of really strong signature sets that dwarf other options continues into Natlan with a new obsidian set that gives 40% crit rate and a 15% damage bonus to every part of her kit. But at least you don't have to worry about this set power creeping the ones for your older characters, as Hoyoverse decided to just racist max and have the effects only applicable to Natlan units. Pretty much the obsidian set should be the only thing you should farm for her. Here is a sheet of her artifact comparisons. If you are using Furina on her teams, which is possible, Marosha is honestly a viable set for her, only giving 4% less crit rate and not buffing her burst. So if you want a filler set until you get a good obsidian set, then this would be it. But obviously on non-Furina teams I wouldn't recommend using this at all. And if you want a filler set that is somewhat less conditional, because most of Mualani's teams use burning, the Reverie, the burning set becomes quite competitive assuming you can maintain burning. But again, the obsidian set is just so much better and less conditional than the 2, so these should only be used as patchwork sets until you're able to build up a strong obsidian set. For main stats, assuming you have the obsidian set, which you should farm, then you are always going to want to have a crit damage circlet. Mualani at a base gets 64.2 crit rate due to her Ascension and the set passive, so using a crit rate circle will put you at a very odd spot to where you're most likely to overcap. The best goblet option is going to be Hydra, but HP percent is only like 5% behind, so if you have a better HP cup then you can use it. And then for the Sands, you always want to use HP percent. Even on vape teams, the EM goblets are like 10% behind, and the substat priority will be on screen now. But that's all we really need to discuss. Her weapon options are up next. Hoyoverse fortunately made this part of the video very easy. In Natlan there is a new craftable coming out called the Ring of Yacht, which has the same stats as Prototype Amber but additionally gives a normal attack damage bonus. Here is a weapon sheet. If there is a weapon not on here, that means it's worse than the Ring of Yacht and therefore not worth using. So don't fucking ask me where is the Baizu signature, Kokomi signature. If it's not on the list, it is worse than the free craftable. Go cope with your bad gambling habits somewhere else. I'm now going to talk about some of the weapon options in more detail so you can get a better grasp grasp of why they're good, starting with her signature. The Surf's Up weapon is her signature, so it's obviously her best in slot. The weapon is worded very confusingly, but as long as each one of your normal attacks is a vaporize hit, you'll upkeep a 48% damage bonus. The only real downside to this weapon is that Mualani's burst is a decent chunk of damage and the only part of her damage that doesn't get reduced in AoE, and the surfing time doesn't really buff it at all, which can be a downside to using this weapon over other options, but overall it's still her general best weapon. The Sacrificial Jade is however a close second to this, giving a ton of EM and HP for Mualani, which buffs all of her damage including her burst, so if you plan on refining Sacrificial Jade you can skip out on pulling for her weapon. A funny thing to note about this weapon though is that it's impossible to not overcap due to the base amount of crit rate you get with Mualani, so you'll be overcapping with this weapon at level 90 but it still gives so many stats that it doesn't matter. I guess if you're a min-maxing mongrel you could just choose to leave the weapon at level 80, as Mualani is a HP scaler and doesn't benefit from the base attack of leveling up the weapon, but that's kind of cringe. You're cringe if you do that. Speaking of cringe, the last weapon I want to discuss is the Widzith, which I didn't put on the list purely because I wanted to talk about how bad it is despite the fact that it looks good on paper. Okay, so if you have an R5 Widzith and are able to get the elemental damage bonus passive, within the duration of the weapon you theoretically will outdo even her signature weapon, but the Widzith fucking sucks. The weapon has a 30-second cooldown so will only work once every other rotation, and if you get the attack buff or are in Widzith's downtime, the weapon is worse than using Prototype Amber, so unless you want to play Reset Impact for the damage buff, I would recommend just using any other option, especially the literal free craftable weapon designed for her. We can talk about her teams now. Actually, I lied. Before talking about her teams, I want to first cover her synergies and explain why certain pairings work, so that when I covered the team section and mentioned flexible units, you'll be able to clank the 2 brain cells you have left to get what I mean. Going by alphabetical order, we have this character, but I actually forgot her name, so could you guys leave it for me down in the comments? She's good for Mualani as she's just a normal attack damage buffer that can slot into her teams with very little investment needed, and she gives around a 35% damage bonus with 27k HP, which you only need a HP main stat for and the rest can go into ER and crit for Favonius. You also arguably don't want to have her C6 as that causes her to apply Hydra, which can be annoying and result in vape losses, so just a nice buffer that can slot in anywhere really. Next up we have Fiorina, who can be used on vape teams. She of course buffs a ton and adds in her own personal damage. You can use her in burn vape setups with Baizu, or you can use her on Siege Green teams in Mono Hydro, and I'll touch on those more in a bit. The new Island 4-star is up next, Kachina, and she can be sparingly used in a few teams like Mono Hydro. The benefit of her being that she's the only character that gets to take full effect of the scroll set, being an off-field unit and Natlan, so you get the full 40% damage bonus. Mona is also very similar to Candace in the sense that she just offers a big damage bonus, thankfully with no stat requirement as you're going to need to build an enormous amount of ER on her. Her skill also applies basically no Hydra, so you won't be stealing vapes as much, and if you have some mono Constellations, because I know you lost at 50-50 last patch, C1 is an extra 15% damage bonus to vape reactions. Next up there's Nahida. Build some ER and use a lot of EM main stats so you can get her EM as high as possible, so she can pass off someone with her burst. That is her main purpose as a support for Shark Girl. She also acts as a fuel for burning because we have quite slow pyro applicators from off field, and burning helps to upkeep a pyro aura consistently for Mualani teams. The last support to talk about is Zhongli, who is a very good shielder while shredding resistances, which is extra helpful on Mualani Emily teams as Emily doesn't have very many ways to receive buffs. You can use him with Archaic Petra and overall he's just a very solid option for her teams. We are going to be closing out this section by talking about her off-field pyro options. Dea gives interruption resistance and with burning is able to help sustain a pyro aura for Mualani to vape everything. The only issue with Dea is that you're going to have to use a highly refined sacrificial greatsword on her, as she has a 20-second cooldown and Mualani can be played on way shorter rotations. You also want to try and cast Dea as close to Mualani's field time as possible so that her interruption resistance lasts as long as possible. Thomas is also a defensive pyro applicator and he has quite a long uptime, especially with Constellations, and thankfully he triggers on Mualani Shark Bites for extra pyro application. He can fit on Mualani short or long rotations due to how low his cooldowns are for the uptime his shield has, and at C6 he also gives a normal attack buff for her. Toma's shield gets stronger as you stack it, so I'd recommend weaving in normal attacks as you cycle through characters to make it stronger. Fine, let's talk about Zhangling. She has consistent pyro application and can solo sustain Mualani assuming no other sources of application mess this up. But she's not a defensive unit, so you're going to want to pair her alongside a defensive character, whether it's Baizu, Zhongli, or another character listed here. On Mualani teams, Zhangling is literally doing 0 damage. Do not care about building damage on her at all. Just stack as much ER as you can, possibly with Fav and some crit rate substats. You can also use the scroll set for more buffing or instructors. Oh yeah, Jinyan now has a team, guys. Jinyan is good especially in vape teams as she can self-apply pyro to herself for consistent double swirl setups. So you can swirl Hydra for Mualani and absorb pyro for the application. Her defensive profile is still quite weak though, and you want her level 3 shield, so you also want to build tons of ER in her. Thankfully Favonia's greatsword gives a ton. I was about to end this section before talking about Emily, but she's also a good staple to Mualani teams, helping enable burning while also doing tons of sustained damage. This is nice as Mualani does big hits infrequently, so Emily's sustained DPS is nice for helping her do damage during downtime periods. Now with all her synergies introduced, let's discuss her team archetypes. Mualani has 4 main team archetypes, 3 of which are just different ways to play vape teams, and the last is mono hydro. The most comfortable recommendation for vape setups is going to be double Dendro burning vape teams. This is because there is no way to mess up this team structure at all, and you can slot in 2 really good Dendro units in Nahida and Emily, as well as being buffed by Dendro Resonance 2 with the 80 elemental mastery increase. Any defensive pyro unit I mentioned can be slotted in here to complete the team, or you could just run a defensive Dendro unit and use Jangling. Then if you just yeet one of the Dendro units, you can run solo Dendro setups, and choose to add in your choice of offensive support from the ones listed in the previous section. So teams like Zhongli, Jangling, and Emily or Nahida. Oh yeah, and being able to run Jangling is a massive upside as you have AoE application, so pyro application against multiple enemies should be more consistent. And before moving on, I just want to make a quick note about Furina's burning vape teams, which is Baizu, Jangling, and of course Furina. In theory, assuming your vape hits line up, this is going to be one of Mualani's better teams, though if you get unlucky with your Furina timing, you're going to lose out on some vapes, which may suck a lot. The team may not be the most consistent thing in the world, but we'll see how that plays in live. Oh yeah, and since Jangling is enough pyro application to sustain Mualani by herself, you could call Zhongli Jangling a core and just run your general support from here, so Mona, Candice, or Nahida. The last vaporized teams to talk about are VV vape teams, where you're slotting in either Kazaha or Sucrose. Okay, the rotation for this team is extremely tight if you want to get a Hydra swirl, but sure, let me explain it. If you are using Jangling as your pyro applicator with Kazaha, in order for you to swirl Hydra and absorb pyro with your burst, you're going to want to apply Hydra, use Guoba, and then switch into your Kazaha so fast to burst on him. So for example, Zhongli's skill to Mualani normal attack to Guoba to Kazaha Q, and as you can see here, we swirled Hydra but absorbed pyro with our burst. And then from there, you're going to want to redo your Mualani combo, and when it ends, you're going to reapply Hydro from it, and then use Jangling's burst to enable your vapes, essentially alternating between Jangling's burst and Kaza's burst for pyro application. Very easy to execute rotation. But if you don't want to jump through all these hoops, Jinyan self-applies pyro through her burst, which is a pyro absorption for Kaza quite easily. So a rotation like this should be quite easy to do. Lastly, Mualani has mono hydro teams, Furina, Seedrine as your team healer, and then either Kaza, Zhongli with Petra, or Kachina as your last slot. It's a pretty simple concept, I'm not going to explain this much. So let's talk about her constellations now. Mualani thankfully has pretty simple constellations, so this section of the video is going to be quite short. Her C1 just buffs the first enhanced shark bite she does by a ton, and this is going to be an 18% damage increase. So yes, if you're rocking the craftable weapon on her, then getting her signature will be a better early damage increase, especially on vaporized teams. Her constellation 2 is on screen if you want to read it, but allows you to get 4 fully enhanced shark bites off in a single target, as well as just making her combos overall a lot more consistent. This is a 13.6% increase over C1 and a 31.6% increase in total, and from now on, I'm not reading these fuck-ass numbers. You better keep your eyes on screen to see the total increases. C3 is +3 to her elemental skill, which is most of her scaling, and ends up being a 15% damage increase. Constellation 4 gives her 8 energy when she picks up a puffer, which you do twice in a rotation, effectively making her a 46 burst cost character. You also get a 75% damage bonus on your burst. They should have just led with that. 10.7% damage increase. C5 is going to be +3 to her burst, a 6% damage increase. And lastly, for her Constellation 6, remember her C1 and how it only applied to the first shark bite? How about it just doesn't do that and applies to all 4 now? This is a 56.7% damage increase, so in total Mualani's constellations increase her damage by 119%. As normal, C2 and C3 are pretty good stopping points, there's no reason for you to go any further. This will conclude the guide portion of the video. Now in regards to how good Mualani will be, she's definitely in the upper tier for carries, even though she doesn't have that many synergistic teams. Her damage at a baseline is just pretty insane. She's pretty heavily bottlenecked by the fact that most of her off-field pyro options aren't that good, so hopefully that's something the Pyro Orcan can fix. Though if you want to pick her up right now, you're still looking at one of the best carries in the game in my opinion, assuming you can get over her playstyle. Her front-loaded nature makes her one of the best boss killers we have, and depending on enemy placements and waves, she can also snooze through most AoE content too. Mualani's playstyle is going to be a gap you have to just get over, as she just awkwardly hugs enemies for a few seconds before she can do damage, which some people may find janky, but that's something you should test out when her trial comes out. But anyways, that's all I have to say. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts on Mualani, as I would love to hear it and I respond to almost every single comment. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys on the flip side. Peace.